This is going to be a compilation of ideas that did not make it. The history of the TERF movement, as like starting out in the 70s with the lesbian separatism movement, and then going on into the 80s and 90s with the political lesbian movement, which is funny because there really was no lesbianism. Like, political lesbianism is a misnomer. I'm inclined to believe kind of a purposeful one, but it's a misnomer nonetheless because you're using lesbianism in a way that it was never intended for, because political lesbians were not people who loved women or were attracted to women. A lot of them were probably more straight women, but they were under the feeling that you could not call yourself a feminist and sleep with or date men. So they were very, very anti anything to do with sex, really. Anti relationships with men or women, but because they lived with women and were friends with these women, they believed that that allowed them to use the lesbian terminology. Like, to me, that is an example of TERFs appropriating lesbianism. I heard someone try and suggest that, like, political lesbians weren't actually the precursor to TERFs, and I'm like, but the thing is, political lesbians, like TERFs, were appropriating the term lesbian to their own end. Like, the whole thing with TERFs, and again, I don't, part of the reason this wasn't going to make its own video was I didn't really think I wanted to talk about TERFs for an extended period of time, because it's not exactly a pleasant topic for me. But I think not acknowledging the reality of it and not acknowledging, like, where this comes from, I think is also a problem. Unfortunately, I do think knowing how TERFs came to be, knowing what the history is, and knowing that as much as they would like to pretend to the contrary, they have never, ever, ever, and will never be a part of the lesbian community. That's why they were separatists in the first place. It started from quote unquote lesbian separatists because they were not a part of the community. They were kicked out because lesbians were like, no, fuck you, we're not doing this shit. So even as far back as like the 70s, this was not a thing. And actually, I think even in the 50s, like, the lesbian separatists were not a fan of butches and studs. And of course, that still rings true, as much as they would like to pretend to the contrary. Like, TERFs are not fans of butches and studs. They think that it, you know, makes the community look bad and that it's regressive and, you know, trying to play straight and all this other shit. So, I mean, realistically, not much has changed in the last 40 years in terms of the political side of these groups. But they still claim to speak for lesbians. They claim to be a part of the community. They claim to have any claim to the community, when in reality, they don't speak for us. They don't know shit about us. They're just using the term because they feel like, oh, well, if you're good friends with a woman. And here's the thing too, right, with the lesbian separatists and with political lesbians. It's the idea of viewing lesbianism as like, well, we live together. We're not seeing any men because, you know, we don't believe in that. But we are ostensibly just roommates because there is no sexual desire there, because they don't desire women, despite the name lesbian. They have no attraction to women at all. They've, you know, and they're not asexual either. They're just the woman version of an incel, really. And that rings true today. TERFs are very much the woman equivalent of an incel. They put themselves in these positions and make themselves the victim, are so shocked that people don't feel any kind of sympathy for them and don't feel sorry for them. It's like, you put yourself in this position. You didn't need to do all this shit. I did try and do some research connecting the dots between lesbian separatists and political lesbians and TERFs. I don't really think it requires a theoretical physicist degree to connect those dots. They're not really hard to connect, let's be honest. Like, these are not dots that don't have tendrils all over each other. Like, they're connecting themselves. Unlike other trans creators, I just don't have that fortitude. I don't have the mental fortitude, or perhaps I don't want to say this to be shady, I don't hate myself enough. I can't like, I can't force myself to try and read this garbage just to make a video. It's very A to B to C. Like, it's a clear evolution in terminology. It doesn't matter now they, you know, want to transfer to like gender critical. At the end of the day, we know what you're talking about. We know what this is, and we know it's bullshit. It's an evolution of language. The political lesbian movement kind of died out. In its place, we have TERFs. Ultimately, there is no denying this is the same movement under different branding. Just because you put a new coat of paint on it and wrote that you're under new management doesn't mean it's less bullshit. If you know what this is, it's not hard. It's not hidden, I'll say. It is not at all hidden. If you read the manifesto of like the political lesbians and you read the manifesto of the lesbian separatists and how they treat gender nonconforming lesbians and lesbians who are butch. I'm very, very good friends with a butch lesbian who is in their 40s, who has said very, very clearly, who only recently, by the way, was able to come out as butch because they felt like when they were younger, they really couldn't because there was such a push within the community to not be butch and not do these things because it was seen as playing into, you know, heterosexuality and heteronormativity, which is fucking bullshit, by the way. It's things that have materially harmed butches and studs for years. And that is why, and it's rare, and I know it's rare, but that is why whenever I do know of someone who is a butch or a stud, who aligns themselves with TERFs, I'm always shocked by it because I'm like, as much as there is this concept that butches are inherently transphobic, that's just not reality. TERFs do not fuck with them. And so this idea, this narrative that TERFs have created that like, oh, we just want to defend lesbians and we want to help No, Mary. No, you fucking don't. You have never been there for butches. You have never been there for studs. You have never been there for anyone who was not your idea of what womanhood should be. If you're going to tell trans women how to do womanhood, what honestly makes anyone think that you're not going to tell everyone how to do womanhood? Like, you don't just start with trans women out of the blue and decide, well, I'm going to tell them how to live their life and I'm not going to tell anyone else. Like, okay, let's pretend for a second you manage to oust all the trans women from lesbianism. You think they're going to stop? No, they don't stop. Like, that's not how any of this works. And so it just baffles my mind. And again, ultimately it's rare. And I do want to say that because I do think there is still, to this day, a stigma that somehow butches and studs are transphobic. I've heard trans people repeat that stigma. I've heard trans straight people repeat that stigma. And I gotta be honest with you, that hurts my soul as someone who is a deep, deep lover and appreciator of butches and studs. It hurts me deeply that there are people who are trans who are under the impression that butches and studs are against them. Because, as I have said in videos before, we have far more in common than we have that separates us. And that is the ultimate truth of the matter. And I think generally speaking, the butches and studs, certainly the ones that I interact with, are trans friendly and are trans supportives. And so I don't worry about it. I don't even think about it, but I know it is something that like is unfortunately a stigmatized belief. So, okay, so here's where it comes from, right? Because I will fully admit I have been guilty of this myself. You know, I'm living now in the South and I moved here because of family. I moved here because I needed a change. I moved here for a lot of reasons. I've had times where I have like felt, my God, did I make a huge mistake? I'm so, I'm scared. But the thing is this, ultimately, the issue isn't the people who live here. There's this idea that like, oh my goodness, the political system here means that people must be okay with that. And the vast majority of people must actually secretly support that. And that's why it continues. Ignoring the fact that we all know and have heard the term gerrymandering for years. We all know about redistricting and how that keeps people disenfranchised. We all know about issues with voter ID laws and making it impossible for people to vote and disenfranchising people from voting, and all of these things that add up to the people who do politically align with myself and with people like me, it amounts to them not being able to vote and not being able to have their voice heard and not being able to make this place representative of who they are. And like, the thing is, I have met so many nice people here. I have met, and by the way, so many queer people here, more so than ever living in Vegas. I lived in Vegas 21 years. I didn't know half as many queer people in 21 years as I met just strangers the first few months I lived here. It's so wild to me. And the other thing is too, right? Because I have friends who still live in Vegas. I have one who is trans themselves and who has often said, like, you know, just, I'm not going to say disparaging, but has very much said, like, I can't believe you moved down there. Like, what were you thinking? But also, like, you know, they should cut Texas and Florida off the map. Like, you know, that the thing I think many of us who are more liberal have said at one time or another. And here's the thing, just because you think living in a blue bubble makes you safe, that doesn't make it reality. I knew plenty of people back in Vegas who experienced homophobic attacks. I mean, God, growing up and going to high school in Vegas was not easy by any means, and not just the summers. Like, it just wasn't easy. I knew very homophobic people growing up, and I certainly might add, there are plenty of people who live in blue states and blue areas who are not necessarily safe. There's this idea that, oh, if you're in a blue state, you're inherently protected. And that's just not reality. There have been trans women who have been harassed and attacked in Hollywood, okay? In the city of Hollywood. So, like, no, you are not safe even in the bluest state in the fucking country. You are not necessarily safe. But there's this idea and there is this narrative that somehow, because you are here and not here where all the bad things happen, that, oh, nothing's going to happen to you. You have nothing to worry about. Nothing possibly could ever happen here. And it's just like, and the reason I say revisionist history too is, like, I think people forget it was not all that long ago that marriage equality was not only not legal, but it was very much up for debate, even in the blue states. Even in the states where we take it for granted now, it was very much up for debate. California literally voted down marriage equality in 2008. I was a sophomore in high school when that Prop 8 thing happened. A sophomore in high school. It was not all that long ago. I was like in my early 20s when marriage equality passed. It's not even been a full decade, and it's already under attack as if it's this, you know, and that's the thing. It's not even been a full decade of queer people being able to get married, and it's already under attack. So, I mean, that's the thing. I think people have this unfortunate idea that it's just always been this way, so, you know, I don't have to worry about it, I don't have to think about it, it's never going to be a question. I know plenty of people who are more Republican leaning who do live in California, so if you think for a second they don't exist in California and they will not vote at the earliest possible opportunity to make it red again. I mean, this is the same state that elected not only the very Republican governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, they also elected the very Republican governor who became the very Republican president, Ronald Reagan. So in case you were under the impression that somehow California is immune to red state bullshit, like, they elected Reagan. Do not forget that. You know, for all of the bullshit we know and for all of the stuff that we can all agree was terrible about him, they still elected him. The UK is considered way more liberal than anywhere in the US, generally speaking. And yet they are experiencing their own version of everything else we're going through right now. So this idea that, like, if you're in a more liberal place, you're fine and you're definitely safe and nothing is going to ever happen to you is just not reality. And I don't say that to be like a fearmonger. I don't say that to make people feel guilty. What I mean is there is this idea that like anyone who lives here or stays here or moves here must align with political views that are against XYZ. They must. There's no way anyone would move to a place like this if they didn't believe it and support it. And it's just not reality. I hate to say like this in any way that's like whatever, but like this is a really beautiful state. There are a lot of really amazing, wonderful people, and I don't regret moving here. I just don't, you know? And if I can help in any way to make this state a better place where people like me can exist without having to worry about anything, then I'm gonna. And like, don't get me wrong. I hate the political system. I've met many people who do not care for the current governor who seems to stick around more and more. And it is kind of wild. This is totally a tangent that is probably not interesting to anyone, but I'm going to say it anyway. It is so wild because I was in Austin for my new hormone doctor. And it's so interesting because Austin is the capital. So that is technically where the governor lives. And it's just so wild to me to think like, you are this like so conservative person and like government surrounded by the queerest city on earth, as far as I'm concerned, that I have ever seen. Like, I have never seen a place that made me feel more accepted than Austin. And like, God, if it weren't so expensive, I would live there in a heartbeat, let me tell you. When this channel pops off, you better believe I am moving my happy ass to Austin. Because I love Austin. It's such a fabulous place. It is so, there again, we're talking about too, there is a city within, you know, a blue oasis in a red state. And I think it's worth noting that many states that maybe vote blue, like Oregon, let's say. Oregon is considered a pretty blue state. But I know there are people there who live in cities that are not the, you know, most friendly and not the most, you know, supportive. So just because a state votes politically align with you does not mean that they agree with you ultimately. You know what I mean? There's this idea that like somehow if your state politically aligns with your beliefs, like the state as a whole, then that must mean that state agrees with you on everything. And that's just not reality. Like even a little bit. And I think people would like for that to be reality. I feel like there are people who very much are trying to, and there are people who have moved here from California because they think, oh, this is going to be more politically advantageous than California. They think, oh, I can move here or, you know, to Vegas and be more of the Republican side, let's say, because they think, well, it's a red state, so I'm going to be safer. I'm going to be more accepted. And it's like, it doesn't mean that they agree with you, actually. And living in a red state doesn't mean that the people in general necessarily don't believe in you and agree with you. I think what you learn the older you get is that in actuality, unfortunately, the political shit that divides us all really, I mean, it matters, but it doesn't, because ultimately everyone's kind of out for themselves politically. Politicians, generally speaking, will say whatever they need to be elected. Like everyone has said and pointed out that until a few years ago, Trump was considered a Democrat, but it became politically advantageous for him to become a Republican. So it is very much a thing of many political groups and leaders following what is politically advantageous. As much as we would like to believe that the Liberal Party has our best interest in mind as queer people because they acknowledge us and are not actively, openly against us, we have to face the reality that as politics are dragged further to the right by a fringe margin of people, so too goes, you know, even the Democratic Party. Like, it is not the same Democratic Party that it was even 20 years ago. If you can't afford to live in the major city, the blueness of the state means nothing to you. And that's the reality. You have to create safeness and community where you are. And I think people deserve that.